to our final podcast of 2020. First, I want to thank all of you who have joined me as I started this podcast journey just this year. Thank you for listening, subscribing, rating, sharing, and especially for reaching out and leaving comments. I so appreciate it. There's more fun coming next year. Please follow me on social media. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @ShakeUpHistory and as Carol Ann Lloyd on LinkedIn. And you can always reach me by email, carolann@carolannlloyd.com. I want to give a shout out to a couple of folks who've really helped make this year so great. Thank you to Heather at Renaissance English History Podcast and TutorCon for inviting me to participate in TutorCon and giving me such great advice about starting a podcast. Thank you to Rebecca and Stephanie at Tudor's Dynasty Podcast for having me on as a guest, which was so much fun. And thank you to FeedSpot for including me in their top 100 European history and top 40 British history podcasts. It's such an honor to be included. And I was thrilled to be number 6 among British history podcasts. For just about 6 months, we've started exploring British history together. So I thought it would be fun for the end of the year to look back at the top 10 royals, rebels, and romantics. I've looked at likes, comments, popular episodes, questions on social media, and here are your top 10. Get comfy, we'll be here a while. Number 10, romantic couples. It's no big surprise Henry VIII didn't make this category, despite a record number of attempts. But you might be a bit surprised that his father did. Even though the marriage between Henry VII and Elizabeth of York was made for completely political reasons, and even though Henry initially manipulated the timing of the marriage until after he was crowned to lessen Elizabeth's claim to the throne, and didn't hold her coronation until after their first son was born, the marriage between Henry VII and Elizabeth of York is clearly the most romantic of all Tudor marriages, and may well be one of the most romantic marriages in royal history. In a time when everyone had a mistress or two or more, Henry VII did not have even one. He was completely faithful to his wife. Stories about them reveal a personal connection that is rare in Tudor marriages. For example, when Prince Arthur died, the king was devastated. His confessor broke the news of his son's death. Henry called for Elizabeth so they could mourn their child together. She consoled the king, reminding him that they had another son and suggesting they could have more children. Then she went back to her bedchamber, where she collapsed in grief. Her ladies requested the king come comfort her, and he did. Certainly in this time of trouble, they comforted each other in a way that seems pretty romantic. Henry's behavior after Elizabeth's death in 1503 is also revealing. She was just 37 years old and died attempting to provide the king another heir. Sadly, the baby girl died as well. Historians describe the king as shattered by his wife's death, and he withdrew from public life for an extended period of time. His own health declined rapidly. After Elizabeth died in the royal apartments in the Tower of London, Henry stopped using the tower as a royal residence. As the years went on, Henry became more paranoid and desperate to exercise complete control over his kingdom and his nobles. It seems that Elizabeth and their relationship was a calming influence on the king, and with her gone, his desperation for wealth and power took over. He considered marrying again, but he never did. He eventually died 6 years later and was buried next to Elizabeth in the tomb he had commissioned in Westminster Abbey. Number 9, underwear. Yes, it seems that royal undies are a hit. The outer clothes are certainly amazing, but we want to take a look and see what's going on underneath, so to speak. Medieval underwear may have shocked us most of all, as a discovery in Langburg Castle in southwest Austria revealed that bras have been around much longer than we thought. During extensive reconstruction work, scholars found an undergarment comprising 2 cups made from pieces of fabric joined by a center seam, eyelets, and straps. Some needle lace even survives at the center. This discovery helped scholars re-examine writings and images from the 14th and 15th centuries with a greater understanding of what women were wearing. It's impossible to talk Tudors without mentioning those all-important pieces of underwear and shapeshifters, the farthingale and the codpiece. First, the Farthingale, which originated in Spain and came to England with Catherine of Aragon in 1501. It took a while to catch on at court, but by the 1540s, it's evident in portraits of Catherine Parr and Elizabeth I. During Elizabeth's reign, the French or drum farthingale became popular. It's also called the wheel, as it resembles a woman standing in the middle of a wheel. It allowed for yards of fabric to be worn, showing off wealth and status. And speaking of status, the bigger the army, the bigger the codpiece? It does seem to have become a status symbol in the reign of Henry VIII. In the years before 1509, the codpiece was a gusset attached to the doublet and worn out of sight. But along came Henry. His ideas about honor and chivalry and manhood were tied up in having a household full of sons. When that didn't happen, he decided to prove his manhood in a different way. During the reign of Henry VIII, the codpiece reached epic proportions, decorated with silk and velvet and even jewels. And Henry's armor certainly tells us a story. Number 8, John of Gaunt's love life and the Wars of the Roses. As I've been working on a project about the Wars of the Roses lately, I've come to realize that most of the problems can be traced back to one man, John of Gaunt. He married 3 times, and his wives and his mistress, one of his wives was first a mistress, made for more than a messy personal life. The personal was definitely political, and his descendants were involved in all the great battles of the Wars of the Roses. It turns out, to create enough chaos to plunge the country into years of civil war, all you need is a wife, a mistress, and children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren willing to take a throne they didn't inherit. With all of that, you end up with the Yorkist and Lancastrian dynasties in your personal family tree. First, Gaunt married Blanche of Lancaster in 1539. She had 3 children who survived: Philippa of Lancaster, Elizabeth of Lancaster, and Henry Bolingbroke. Sadly, she died in 1568 at age 22. John then married Constance of Castile. They had a daughter, Catherine, who married the King of Castile. During his marriage to Constance, John began an affair with Elizabeth Swynford. That's where things got really interesting. Gaunt and Swynford had 4 children who survived: John, Henry, Thomas, and Joan. For whatever reason, Gaunt immediately acknowledged them all as his children and took responsibility for them. They weren't eligible for the name Lancaster, of course, so he gave them the name Beaufort. After Constance of Castile died in 1394, everyone thought Gaunt would make another politically advantageous marriage. But he didn't. He married his mistress, making Catherine Swynford wife number 3. Then he struck a deal with King Richard II in 1397 to declare the Beaufort children legally legitimate according to church and state law. Interestingly, 2 years later, Gaunt's son Henry Bolingbroke knocked Richard II off the throne and started the Lancastrian claim as King Henry IV. Meanwhile, the Beauforts were making advantageous marriages with their new legitimate status. John Beaufort had a granddaughter named Margaret Beaufort and a great-grandson named Henry Tudor. Joan Beaufort married Ralph Neville and had some famous grandchildren, including Edward, Duke of York, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester. So, in 1461, the descendants of John of Gaunt's mistress, namely Edward, Duke of York, assisted by Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, knocked the descendants of his first wife, that would be Henry VI, great-grandson of Blanche of Lancaster, off the top branch of the family tree and the throne of England. Edward, Duke of York, became King Edward IV. Later, the Beauforts were fighting among themselves as Henry Tudor, John's descendant, took the throne from Richard III, Joan's descendant. So, basically, the event we call the Wars of the Roses could be called the catastrophic consequences of John of Gaunt's love life. Number 7, Queen Victoria. She was the youngest woman to be crowned Queen of England. She started with a couple of political missteps, including her terrible treatment of Lady Flora Hastings, and her mishandling of her staff during a changing government. But she grew into her role and had an extraordinary reign. Her 63 years on the throne was longer than any of her predecessors. Victoria gave her name to an age and is associated with the extraordinary changes in social status, lifestyle, technology, and world events. For one thing, there was a flowering of artists, writers, and poets in Great Britain. Some even consider the Victorian age to be a second Renaissance. It was also a time of improvement in healthcare and technology, and as a result, there were no major epidemics in Britain during the Victorian age. Mortality rates decreased, and fertility and childhood survival increased, including at the palace, where the Queen had an astonishing 9 children. Inventions, from sewing machines to railways, and from telephones and incandescent lights and improved sanitation techniques, made life easier and faster paced. Alongside her husband, Prince Albert, Queen Victoria redefined the monarchy. In 1852, she established protocols by attending the first state opening of Parliament at the new Palace of Westminster and processing through Parliament before making her speech. In 1858, she and Prince Albert promoted the constitutional monarchy to stem the tide of growing Republican sentiment. And in 1860, she and Albert allowed photographs of the royal family to be sold for the first time. The set of 14 photos sold more than 60,000 copies and might be the very thing that kicked off celebrity culture and the paparazzi. And then, of course, Victoria and Albert significantly reimagined the way British families celebrated Christmas, establishing traditions that last to this day. After Albert died, Victoria retired from public life for years, but she returned to the public eye and continued to shine. In 1877, she became Empress of India, following the advice of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. In 1887, she celebrated 50 years on the throne with her Golden Jubilee. 10 years later, she marked her 60th year on the throne with a Diamond Jubilee. The Queen demonstrated her interest in technology by sending a telegram to thank her subjects across the empire for their love and support. She died less than 5 years later, ending an extraordinary reign and age. Number 6, Jean Gerard, spy extraordinaire. Rebel Jean Gerard might not be the most famous spy. We might not have a remember the 6th of November type rhyme about him. And in fact, lots of people have no idea who he is. But he represents the dedication and ingenuity and success of spies in the court of Queen Elizabeth I and King James I. And that in turn reveals what an amazing spy network had been established by Queen Elizabeth's spy master, Francis Walsingham. There were numerous challenges to the reign of Elizabeth I. After 1568, Mary Queen of Scots was in England as the Catholic alternative, while Elizabeth was a target for Catholics at home and abroad. Along with William Cecil, Walsingham and his team of watchers set out to trap Mary Queen of Scots and her Catholic followers as they planned to assassinate Queen Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne of England she had coveted for so long. Jean Gerard is an example of the resilience of the Catholic movement, which long outlived Mary Queen of Scots. A trained priest and recruiter, he was arrested in 1594 and sent to the Tower of London. By 1597, he had befriended his jailer and convinced him to allow Gerard to receive oranges from his friends. Using a toothpick he had previously convinced the jailer to allow him to have, Gerard used orange juice to send secret messages that could only be read when held to a fire. Using these messages, Gerard arranged for his friends to smuggle him a rope. He used the rope to climb out of the tower, despite the injuries his hands had suffered from torture. Eventually, he made his way out of the tower and into a waiting boat, which rowed him away to freedom. Gerard became a hero for Catholics in England, who saw his safety as a miracle and kept him successfully hidden through the rest of Elizabeth's reign. This escape from the tower was recognized by Time magazine as one of the top 10 prison escapes of all time. Gerard was implicated in the gunpowder plot during the reign of James I, but he successfully avoided capture. Disguised as a footman in the retinue of the Spanish ambassador, Gerard managed to slip out of England and return to Europe in his work with the Jesuits. He lived until 1637, dying at age 73. It was an extraordinary life for a rebel spy. Number 5, Richard III. One of the most controversial kings of England, and the only person who's gotten me attacked on Twitter. Richard III is the most recent choice for top 100 most fascinating characters in history. And it's not the only time he was at the top of that list. Richard continues to fascinate us, and scholars continue to reimagine his life and reign. It seems we just can't get enough of Richard III. What makes him so endlessly fascinating? Well, for one thing, he is at the center of one of the greatest royal mysteries of all time. In 1483, King Edward IV died. He expected his son, Prince Edward, to take the throne as Edward V. In fact, the 12-year-old prince was proclaimed King Edward V. King Edward V's coronation was planned for June 22nd, but on that day there was no ceremony. Instead, a sermon preached outside St. Paul's maintained that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid. Their children were illegitimate. The Duke of Clarence's son was illegitimate. And that meant the next in line for the throne was, you guessed it, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. On July 6th, almost exactly 3 months after the death of his brother Edward IV, Gloucester was crowned King Richard III. So what happened to Edward V and his brother? They were the focus of early rebellions against Richard III. They were seen playing in the grounds of the Tower for a few months, but by fall, they had disappeared. Most in Richard's day believed the boys were dead. But were they? What happened to them? It's a mystery. Richard keeps our attention in other ways as well. He made a surprise appearance in 2012 when the University of Leicester and Leicester City Council joined with the Richard III Society to embark on a search for the king's remains. They were looking for the site of Greyfriars Church, where it was believed he might have been buried. In one of those truth is stranger than fiction moments, the remains were found in the first location the excavators started digging, almost directly under an R someone had painted to mark the spot reserved. It turned out to be reserved for more than 500 years. After a series of forensic tests, the remains were identified as Richard's. The skeleton revealed how the king was killed in battle and confirmed the rumors, perpetuated by Shakespeare and previously dismissed by some scholars, that Richard did indeed have scoliosis. Controversies continued through a debate about where the remains should be buried. Some felt the king should be buried at York Minster, a place personally connected to him. But it was decided the remains would be reburied at Leicester. A ceremony was held in March 2015 for the king's reburial. Perhaps Richard III can rest in peace at last. Number 4, Secrets of the Six Wives. The ever-popular Six Wives of Henry VIII keep our attention as well as Richard III does. You'll find several of them on that same most fascinating characters list. But is there more to learn? Don't we know it all? That's the beauty of history. There's always more to learn. And it's especially true of these women. Here are a few things you might have forgotten. Catherine of Aragon was named Spanish ambassador to the English court in 1507, 5 years after the death of her first husband, Prince Arthur, and 2 years before she married King Henry VIII. She was the first female ambassador in European history. Anne Boleyn became Marquess of Pembroke in 1532. Henry VIII created the title especially for her and conducted the ceremony himself. Anne was awarded lands in Wales that were valued at more than £1,000. She is the only person to ever hold this title. Jane Seymour was a religious conservative who petitioned for mercy for the Catholics who rebelled against the king during the Pilgrimage of Grace. Legend has it that he told her to stop interfering and to remember what had happened to her predecessor. So maybe she wasn't always his favorite wife after all. Anne of Cleves was wise enough to respond favorably to Henry's request for an annulment after just 6 months of marriage. As a result, she was awarded an annual income, use of Richmond Palace, Bletchling Manor, and Hever Castle, and recognized as the king's sister. Historian Tracy Borman suggests she might have been Henry's most successful wife. Catherine Howard married the king when she was about 18 years old, and Henry was a very old 50. Desperate to cling to his vision of himself as a vital, potent king, Henry created a narrative of Catherine as his rose without a thorn and woman without a past. When that story fell apart, the king allowed Norfolk's enemies to destroy her. Catherine Parr was Henry's most experienced wife, with 2 previous marriages and 1 after his death. She's the only Queen of England to have been married 4 times. She's also the first Queen of England to publish a book as queen, and the only Queen of England to be buried on private land. Number 3, diamond rings and all that bling. Diamond may be a girl's best friend, but through the years there's been quite a bit of love shown for rubies and emeralds and sapphires and pearls as well. Mary Tudor was given the famous pearl La Peregrina by her husband Philip of Spain, and it features prominently in her portraits. After Mary's death, the famous jewel passed back to the Spanish royal family. It eventually made its way to Lord James Hamilton, who sold it at auction, where Richard Burton bought it for wife Elizabeth Taylor, a jewel fit for royalty of all kinds. The famous 3 Brethren jewel didn't last into the modern age. Worn by Elizabeth I and James I, the jewel included 3 large spinels that looked like rubies set in a diamond with a pyramid cut in the middle. The center stone was thought to be the largest diamond in Europe in the 15th century. Elizabeth wore it as a brooch, and James used it as a pin attached to his hat. When Charles I and his wife Henrietta Maria inherited it, they considered it their personal property. Sadly, there's no record of the piece after that. The current queen certainly continues the tradition of wonderful royal jewelry. She regularly wears her favorite 3-strand pearl necklace and a brooch. Here are some of her favorite brooches and a few of the special times she has worn them. The Prince Albert brooch is one of the most historic, as it was given to Queen Victoria by Prince Albert before their wedding. Queen Victoria wore it pinned to her wedding dress. All the queen consorts after Victoria wore the brooch, and Queen Elizabeth II wears it frequently. The Queen inherited the true lover's knot brooch from Queen Mary, who purchased it in 1912. Queen Elizabeth wore it to Prince William's wedding to Catherine Middleton in 2011. The Queen also inherited the Cullinan 3 and 4 brooches from Queen Mary. Often worn together, these large diamonds from the Cullinan collection are sometimes informally referred to as Granny's chips. Appropriately enough, the Queen wore them to her Diamond Jubilee in 2012. The flower basket brooch was given to then Princess Elizabeth to celebrate the birth of her first child and heir, Prince Charles. When Prince William's first child and heir, Prince George, was born in 2013, the Queen wore it to his christening. It has come to be associated with the continuity of the monarchy. If you want to hear more about jewels, check out the new History Gems podcast by the wonderful historian Nicola Tallis. There are links in the show notes. Number 2, Elizabeth and Elizabeth. The 2 Queens Elizabeth are some of the most popular monarchs in British history. Both are regularly included in lists of best and most popular rulers. Elizabeth I is, along with her father, the face of the famous Tudor dynasty. Unlike her father, she is famous for never marrying. Her 45-year reign is the longest of the Tudor monarchs and is generally considered one of the most glorious in English history. One of her nicknames reflects this. She is sometimes called Gloriana. She kept her personal religious beliefs close to the vest and refused to, quote, make windows into men's souls. She was pragmatic in her approach to the religious chaos of her half-sisters and half-brothers' reigns before her, adopting a position of compromise that contributed to England's avoiding the religious wars that gripped some other countries at this time. Elizabeth I displayed an extraordinary talent for selecting ministers whose judgment both challenged and complemented her own. She tasked her first and surely most trusted minister, Sir William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh, with telling her what she needed to hear instead of what she wanted to hear. They didn't always agree, and she didn't always take his counsel. But they worked together for years, and it's said that her history cannot be told without mentioning him. Other essential members of her team included Sir Christopher Hatton and Sir Francis Walsingham. And then there was Robert Dudley. No one really knows the full story of Elizabeth and her favorite. She railed against him when he let her down, and she was furious with jealousy when he married her kinswoman, Lettice Knowles. But she cherished Dudley and seemed to have trusted him as she trusted no one else in her life. His death devastated her, and she kept his final letter next to her bed, marked with her note, his last letter. Elizabeth's reign was one of danger and destruction, but it was also one of the flowering of the arts. Musicians William Byrd and Thomas Tallis created masterpieces at her court. The first permanent theater was constructed during her reign, and she regularly had plays performed for her at court. Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Kidd, Thomas Dekker, and of course William Shakespeare flourished during her reign. Elizabeth styled herself as the Virgin Queen, married and devoted to her country and her people. In her final speech to Parliament, she declared that, quote, "Though you may have had, and may have, many mightier and wiser princes sitting in this seat, yet you never had, nor shall have, any that will love you better." End quote. She told her MPs that, quote, "There is no jewel, be it of ever too high a price, which I set before this jewel. I mean your love." End quote. She worked to gain and maintain her people's support and affection. Her reign brought successes during a time of danger. The English people remembered her and celebrated her accession date as a national holiday for 200 years. Almost exactly 400 years after that accession date, another 25-year-old woman named Elizabeth took the throne. Unlike Elizabeth I, Elizabeth II had been raised in a happy home, and her father was dedicated to preparing her for her eventual accession to the throne. Like the first Elizabeth, in her early years she was not expected to become queen. After all, when her grandfather died, the crown would pass to her uncle, not her father. But Edward VIII abdicated the throne, Elizabeth's father became George VI, and Elizabeth became heir to the throne. The coronation of Elizabeth II on June 2nd, 1953, was the first coronation ceremony to be televised live and watched around the world. It was just the beginning of the Queen's relationship with an explosion of new technology, and the first step in the ongoing dance of sharing her life with the public while maintaining the privacy she has always desired. Her coronation was watched by 27 million people in the United Kingdom alone, and another 3 million lined the route where she made her procession from Westminster Abbey back to Buckingham Palace. The Queen seemed to be emulating the first Elizabeth, taking steps to establish a relationship with her people. She set aside centuries of tradition to stroll casually through the crowds, greeting people in person instead of waving from a distance. This started a new tradition, the walkabout, which is now an essential part of royal visits. According to a recent biographer, Queen Elizabeth understands the importance of being in the presence of her people. She is reported to have said, quote, "I have to be seen to be believed." She typically wears solid, bright colors, so she's easily spotted in a crowd. The longest reigning monarch in British history, Queen Elizabeth II has celebrated numerous milestones along her reign. In 1977, she celebrated her Silver Jubilee for 25 years on the throne. In 2002, the Queen celebrated her Golden Jubilee. A series of tragic events preceded the celebration, including the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, in 1977, and the deaths of Princess Margaret and the Queen Mother in 2002. Queen Elizabeth traveled more than 40,000 miles that year, visiting countries around the world and making stops throughout the United Kingdom. The Queen celebrated her Diamond Jubilee in 2012, marking an amazing 60 years on the throne. Queen Victoria is the only other British queen to celebrate a Diamond Jubilee, which she did back in 1897. The Queen has lived long enough to see the future. Her son, Prince Charles, will ascend to the throne next. He'll be followed by his son, Prince William, who was born in 1982. And then it will be Prince George, the Queen's great-grandson, born in 2013. Nearly 75 years after she pledged that her whole life would be devoted to the service of her people, the Queen has provided continuity in the monarchy for decades to come. And number 1, Christmas celebrations. Here are just a few of the things we've learned by stepping into Christmas celebrations from medieval times until today. And just in case you're planning to carry on your celebrations until Candlemas, as some lucky people did in days past, here are some ideas for your ongoing revelries. If you make Christmas all about yourself, like William the Conqueror did when he scheduled his coronation for Christmas Day in 1066, things might not turn out the way you expected. William's supporters were so boisterous that his guards worried about foul play and basically lit London on fire. Not a good way to start a new reign. On the other hand, medieval celebrations include some great traditions. People decorated their spinning wheels as a sign they would not work during the 12 days of Christmas. Many landowners held open houses, inviting people from the village to come and enjoy feasts they wouldn't otherwise be able to experience. And people saved a bit of the Yule log to use to light the log the next Christmas. The Tudors were big on gift giving, just like they were big on most things. The marvelous gift rolls of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I give us some wonderful insights into the politics of gift giving at the Tudor court. But it's a nice thought that one of Henry VIII's favorite gifts was a portrait of his son, Prince Edward, given to the king by Hans Holbein in the 1538-39 Christmas season. It was certainly a politically astute gift on Holbein's part, but it's also nice to think of Henry's favorite gift being a portrait of his child. The Victorians were Christmas central. Prince Albert picked up on the Christmas tree tradition started by Queen Charlotte and Queen Caroline, bringing several trees into Windsor Castle for the royal family's Christmas. The royals' enthusiasm for Christmas spread, helped by the inventions of the time. The Victorian Christmas saw the establishment of the Christmas tree as an essential part of the holiday, as well as the inauguration of such holiday fun as Christmas cards, Christmas crackers, and presents exchanged on Christmas Day. The Victorians certainly helped Christmas achieve its prominence as a major holiday once again. And more recently, the 20th and 21st century royals have carried on many Victorian Christmas traditions, as well as making their own. The celebration shifted from Windsor Castle to Sandringham House with Edward VII. King George V delivered the first Christmas broadcast from Sandringham in 1932. His son carried on the tradition, which was especially important in 1939 on the first Christmas of World War II. Queen Elizabeth II delivered her first Christmas address from the same desk and chair her father and grandfather had used, but immediately made the tradition her own when the next year she broadcast from New Zealand. In 1975, the Queen's speech was televised for the first time, as it has been ever since. The Queen's Christmas speech in 2020 was unlike any other, delivered from Windsor Castle, but with a socially distanced and reduced crew, and as part of a celebration that, for the first time, she did not share with her family. Her Majesty reflected that, quote, "Remarkably, a year that has necessarily kept people apart has, in many ways, brought us closer," end quote, going on to praise those who have been volunteering and demonstrating a quiet, indomitable spirit in the face of the worldwide pandemic. She expressed gratitude for frontline workers, medical professionals, and Good Samaritans. Mentioning those who have lost loved ones and are missing family and friends, the Queen assured them, quote, "If you are among them, you are not alone, and let me assure you of my thoughts and prayers," end quote. That seems a good place to end our look back at the royals, rebels, and romantics. Many were moved by and expressed appreciation for the Queen's speech, especially this year. And in this challenging time, let's all learn from the powerful lessons of history and use our words and actions to help others and make the world a bit happier each day. I'll end by thanking you for your listening ears and wonderful support. I am so looking forward to exploring history next year with you. Lots of fun and surprises ahead. Stay tuned.